quality and you can hear what the presenters are actually sharing with you. Use the raise hand feature if you have access to the control panel. If you experience any technical difficulties, just going to use that, especially around notifying us for the CEUs. I've experienced that in at least one other session I moderated, so don't hesitate to use that feature for whatever reason you're experiencing tech difficulties. And then this session is being recorded. So you might have seen that announcement. It's being recorded. It'll also be posted on the Michigan Campaign to End Homelessness website, along with the slide deck. So if you're trying to take copious notes during the session, that's great, but you don't have to, because we'll make sure the slide deck and all of the material are made available and posted on the campaign's website. And then lastly, attendees seeking CEUs must both check in and out using the chat feature. So use the chat box to check in and out if you want to be considered for CEUs. So make sure to start checking in now if you haven't already, and out on the back end to be in line to receive those CEUs. All right, so very quickly, want to make sure that you're in the right spot. So if you're in the session, you're hoping to hear about some examples, 4 examples across the state of communities that are showcasing their efforts to ground their local homeless response efforts in race equity, and building out strategies that are informed by persons with lived experience and expertise. And that work is absolutely in lockstep with the statewide commitment to address racial equity codified in the Michigan Campaign to End Homelessness 3-year plan that runs from 2020 to 2022. So again, with the objectives, very similar. You would have saw this maybe on the front end before you thought about registering. That's what we're hoping you'll walk away with, a more deepened understanding of some of the challenges and opportunities experienced by your colleagues in 4 parts of the state's geography across 4 communities. And then you also just get a better sense of, its relevancy and connectedness back to the Michigan Campaign to End Homelessness activities, and then also why it's important for those of you on this webinar, part of this session, really hoping to connect the dots a little bit more strongly. Hopefully you'll walk away with a better sense of that after the session. So very quickly, a high-level overview of the agenda. This is how we hope to get there. So I'll just share with you the objectives in the session overview. We're going to use this framework to get us there. So I'll cover a little bit of level setting and background, which I already started to do, and then I'll pass it along to some panelists who I'm really excited for you to hear from. You'll hear from Jessica sharing the experience of the balance of state. You'll hear from Leah representing Oakland, Morgan out in Washtenaw, and Tasha representing Detroit's experience. And then we'll hopefully engage in some Q&A with you folks. Again, I strongly encourage you, as the panelists are sharing their content from their respective communities, do not hesitate to utilize the chat feature to drop in questions so you don't lose them, or you can hold them to the end, whatever works for you. So before I hand it off to Jessica to talk about the balance of state, I wanted to take a moment to sort of really make sure that we're all on the same page, do a little bit of level setting around why this is important. Why, probably at every opportunity you've heard us talk about, if you were on the plenary session earlier with the campaign update connected to the plan, you heard it. You might have also heard racial equity come up and be elevated in any of the sessions that you've been attended. So I wanted to just do a bit of level setting. So on the slide, if you're following along, we just elevated the racial disparities at the highest level across Michigan, specifically as it relates to folks experiencing homelessness. So if you're looking on the left-hand side there, in particular, I'm going to call out folks identifying it as Black or African American, while only making up 13% of the general population. We see that consistently they make up half of, if not more, so 52% of the population experiencing homelessness. This is from our 2019 data, and that's cross-compared with census data. We saw similar disparities in the 2018 data and in the 2017 data. So for a number of years, we've been reporting on the presence of racial disparities along with health disparities, but really elevating and lifting up the presence of racial disparities. And for folks that are on the call and are wondering why, or for folks who are really aware, just a reminder, right? Catastrophic events from everything from slavery to legal segregation absolutely led to the systematic denial of access and equal rights for folks identifying as Black and African American. And while many of those events are often quickly regarded as historic, their long-lasting effects, as well as coupled with present day actual discrimination, perpetuate the racial disparities in housing and adjacent sectors like criminal justice, child welfare, health, and many other sectors. Those all taken together often contribute to disparities, or directly contribute to the disparities that folks identifying as Black or African American face. And that's exactly why we see higher rates of homelessness for Black folk or African American folk compared to all other populations. But that we already knew, right? Again, I mentioned that we've elevated this fact on many occasions before, most notably with our annual report on homelessness across the state. That we knew, and you told us that we knew it, you knew it, and we kept talking about it. And so we heard you loud and clear push us to get beyond just acknowledging the problem, right? The presence of the racial inequities and the disparities in and of themselves. We heard you on the nudges and the pushes around how do we begin to be responsive and identify a path forward to respond to the racial disparities and the inequity across our state. And we're starting to listen, right? And the we, I mean the campaign leadership. So Michigan Campaign and Homelessness in our collective, our 3-year plan that spans 2020 to 2022, made a statewide commitment to addressing racial equity, right? Addressing racial inequity and striving towards racial equity. So we codified that commitment in the plan in a number of ways. One, as one of our 4 guiding principles. And if you're following along on the screen, you see that in the pink bar down at the bottom. Addressing racial disparities, both those that are active as well as those that are a little bit more passive and inactive, is a commitment of campaign leadership, along with goals or guiding principles that connect to better utilizing data for the purpose of prioritizing resources and serving folks most effectively, partnering with folks with lived experience more authentically, and then a guiding principle around cross-sector collaborative work in service of serving folks most optimally. So addressing racial disparities was something that we codified in that way. We also more explicitly codified our commitment to addressing racial equity through the actual the strategies in the strategic plan and the corresponding sub-strategies. So one of the big ways in which we have done this is allocating resources through MISHDA and under the campaign to build both state level and community level capacity to advance racial equity. So our hope is that we will go into 2021 with a national racial equity expert and contractor under contract to begin the work over just shy of 2 years with the state of Michigan and at the community level to help build out our capacity and better understand what we need to move the dial. And then also connected to that commitment to advance equity across Michigan is the work that the campaign is doing to better understand what's the best structure, what's the most optimal and equitable structure to get us to the goals codified in the actual plan. And some of that may be changing the way and I would imagine would be making some changes and amendments to our actual structure that better align with advancing racial equity. And so our hope is that we'll learn a bit more about where we need to be in Michigan relative based on our actual data, both quantitative and qualitative, and the expert opinions of racial equity experts. And so we hope that you will be along for the ride. We certainly intend to ensure that consultants are engaged at all levels across the state and certainly engaged at the community level. So before we transition to the first update. We'll transition to the first update. The 4 communities who have begun doing that work. There are various stages on the continuum, from both acknowledging the presence of racial inequity to implementing policies, procedures, and practices at the local continuum level to be responsive. And so the work that you'll hear from the balance of state, Oakland, Washtenaw, and Detroit is absolutely aligned with the statewide commitment to address equity. And without further ado, I am going to pass it off to Jessica Mays to kick us off with the community highlights.
Thanks, Mercedes. Can you hear me okay before you go off?
Yeah, you sound great. Thanks, Jessica.
Okay, great. Thanks. Just wanted to do a quick check on that. So thanks, everybody. I'm really excited to be here and talking with you, although I'm most glad that I get to go first of the different communities speaking on this today, because I wouldn't want to have to follow them. So if you want to go ahead and advance the slide there. A little bit about what Michigan Balance of State is. We are 61 counties, so all of those in blue here, just to give you kind of a picture of the area that we cover within our COC. And as you can probably imagine, the state is different from when you look at kind of all the way down to the southernmost point up to the northern and westernmost points of the state. We have a lot of different experiences. So we're definitely in a pretty unique situation, I think, from most COCs. You can go to the next slide. So a little bit more about us. We're back to that demographic data. That I know whenever we start talking about this stuff, we like to throw out numbers, and mine aren't in as pretty a format as the last slide you saw with data. But just to kind of look at this to give you a little bit of a snapshot about what balance of state looks like. What I'd like to point out here is that we've got in the far right the U.S. Census data of the 61 counties added together there. So if you look at the white non-Hispanic Latino, that is 89% looking at our census data. So definitely higher than what we saw. I think it was 79% or closer to 80% on the slide that Mercedes showed for the state of Michigan. So we see less diversity across those balance of state communities. However, if you look at those folks that we see in our services, and this is pulled from our LSA data from 1819, that goes down to 76%. And so then you can see from there down folks that identify as Hispanic or Latino, Black or African American, American Indian or Alaska Native. We're seeing a huge disparity between the number of folks that we have in the census data and those that are coming for services. So what this shows is that even though one of the challenges across balance of state is that a lot of folks might look around and go, we can't have a problem with race equity here because everybody here is white. You know, I look around and my day to day, I'm not really engaging with folks that don't look like me. And so how could this be an issue? But we know that it is because people live there and people are still experiencing that disparate impact of homelessness within those counties. So it's just as important, even in these less populated rural counties, it's just as important that we address race equity. So next slide. So some of the challenges, like I said, within rural homelessness, the problems aren't glaring. And that's not just with racial equity issues, but that's also with homelessness in general. We don't have as many of those kind of city centers where you might see people on the street. Folks tend to be kind of in areas that folks might not ever kind of travel through. There might be a lot more kind of couch surfing situations. So it's just not as in your face or visible in rural areas. The other issue is that we have a lot of population variances across balance of state because it's rural, because we're so spread out. So what we see in the northern areas especially are that we have a lot of issues with folks who are Native American that are falling into homelessness at higher rates. And so that's a very different kind of situation and takes different solutions that we might see with different populations in other parts of the state. And then another challenge is our lack of capacity and funding. And I say generally with our funding because we know that we've kind of gotten inundated with funds through the last couple of months. But generally we don't have a whole lot of extra money to do the work, which I'm sure we can say about just about every community, right? So part of the solutions here. So recognizing that we are not the experts, we don't have the answers, or else we would have probably, hopefully, if we knew what to do, we would have been doing it sooner. So the biggest step for us was to reach out and find some experts to lead us. And that's been a partnership with Spark. So Regina Cannon, who gave the great keynote speech at the kickoff of this conference, she and her team have really done amazing things for Balance of State. So that first looked like partnering with Micah to bring them in to do some kind of 101 type trainings and just try to kind of bring that kind of awareness and level setting for everyone across Balance of State. We offered scholarships for folks to be able to attend because we really thought that this was a valuable training and we didn't want barriers for folks in accessing it. And then after that, we thought, well, okay, we could keep training people because we know that we always need that 101, but we also wanted to do something a little more active. We wanted to put some stuff into place. So right now we're working with Spark on a system review. They've been looking at all of our policies and procedures and are helping us by reviewing those policies and giving some suggestions for changes, and then also created the self-assessment tool for us. So we're really excited to actually have some tools to be able to implement and see hopefully some ways to really put this into practice and change. And then the next solution is just going to be that continued focus. We know that this is work that we're going to have to stay on top of and make sure that it's always integrated into all of the work and solutions that we do. So next slide. So the next endeavors that we have are rolling out that data assessment tool. And just in that, as you can imagine, 61 counties, that's going to take a lot of effort. Across the 61 counties, folks are in all different kind of levels of capacity and abilities to coordinate, being able to implement the tool. So we're going to have different approaches of how we reach out to communities to encourage them to do that. So some of that's going to be by looking at some of our communities with higher capacity and having them do the assessment tool and then be able to kind of report out to everybody else, how did it work, what were the lessons learned, how did they use it? And then it might go down to as much as being able to help other communities that need more help with me as their coordinator, actually they're working through it with them. So we're trying to kind of meet everybody where they're at to be able to engage with this. We're also looking at better ways to analyze the data to determine priority areas for further training. So as we're doing those assessment tools, how are we taking that information back and figuring out like where do we need to put our money at what areas do we need to put money and time into next. We're also really trying to figure out new ways to engage persons with lived experience. In the very rural, spread out areas with not a whole lot of Wi-Fi or transportation options, this gets even more difficult, I think. And so we want to figure out how do we best do this in a meaningful way. And so we're kind of trying to figure out different approaches on how we can do that. And then finally, recognizing that trying to find ways to engage with persons with lived experience and people with color in these communities. Sometimes that doesn't look as deep of a partnership as what we really want. And what we'd love to see is that more of our agencies across Balance of State are actually hiring people with lived experience and are hiring people of color so that it's not kind of one-off experiences, that we're actually bringing people in, they're part of the work, they're part of the leadership, and they're engaging in solutions long term. So that's ideally what we'd like to explore and see. So as I said, I'm certainly not an expert in any of this. I just like to try to engage with folks that have good expertise and and I'm happy to share kind of what we've learned from them with you all here. And that is all I have for my section, Mercedes.
Awesome. Thanks, Jessica. Thank you so much. You'll get an opportunity. If you have questions for Jessica, get them in the chat, hold them to the Q&A. We are going to keep moving along and kick it off to Leah McCall from Oakland to shed some light on what Oakland's doing around race equity.
Great. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you sound great.
All right, perfect. Perfect. Wow, thank you for this opportunity to present today. Like Mercedes said, I am with the Alliance for Housing, which is the Continuum of Care in Oakland County. Next slide, please. All right, so just a little background of what the Alliance for Housing is as the Continuum. I don't need to read to you. I'll give you like 10 seconds and we'll move to the next slide. All right, thanks. So data, all right, that's where we started. That's where probably most people start. And I think I've looked at data a long time in the work that I've done in the homelessness realm, but it wasn't really until I was at the COC level that I could see it system-wide and sort of look at things at a bigger picture. And similar to the slide that Mercedes showed, I think hers was 13% in Michigan and 52% in our homeless services for African American or Black. Ours is actually 67.14 African American or Black, and only 14% in Oakland County. So again, that's where we started with this sort of look and looking to reduce disparities, address people who are marginalized, and we've decided to partner with Regina Cannon as well, with C4 Innovations, and deepen our work in racial equity. Next slide, please. All right, so where are we now? The Alliance did partner with C4 through a funded partnership with McGregor. So that's really where we started this work and doing some research and deciding that this was something that we could not address. And so that's where we began our work. Of course, COVID happened and that slowed everything down. Our timeline changed. It looked a little bit different how we would engage with each other, how we would meet with each other. So some of that did change a little bit, but we really have started to do that work virtually. We've been working with C4 for about 4 months and had a kickoff with our community partners in September. So that was our annual retreat, and Regina came and spoke and really just kind of talked about engaging the community and how all of the pieces of the community can work together to address this. It's not just a homelessness issue. It's not, one sector of the work that needs to change. So we also talked a little bit more about how will we engage people with lived experience during a pandemic. Transportation is always an issue, but there's nowhere to transport people to, right? We're not meeting, we're not really getting together. So we've tried to come up with some different ways, talked about hot spots, calls, working with individuals who are engaged directly in some of the spaces that we could involve individuals with lived experience. So that is our biggest, I think, challenge right now, is kind of moving forward in that area. So right now we're in sort of our training phase, conducting, surveys, analysis, identifying teams of people to work together with us, on-site sort of training virtually, 101, what does that look like? How can we work together on this endeavor? And that brings us to really our next slide. All right, so what's coming up next, right? Where are we? We are assembling a racial equity design and implementation team that will cover specific areas that we want to address. There's many more areas, right? These are the 4 that we're starting with in our work group teams. So we really want to look into services, behavioral, medical and support services, expanding affordable housing. That is probably one of the biggest issues that we have in general here, especially even with additional dollars through COVID. we really still have a need for affordable housing, again, eviction prevention, law enforcement, and the judicial system. So all of those pieces working together so we can align our framework for our collective impact response, where our work will be defined and shared and using data to show us where the greatest inequities are occurring and move together to address those issues. I think that's my last slide. That's all I have today. I don't even think I needed the timer.
I'm so impressed with you, Leah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
If folks haven't picked up already, these are lightning speed sort of community spotlights because we have 4 and we are most interested in you being able to engage with the panelists. So thank you so much, Leah. All right, we will hand over the spotlight, no pun, to Morgan Boydston, the Human Services Manager in Washtenaw County at the Office of Community and Economic Development. Talk about Washtenaw's experience.
Thanks. Thanks, Mercedes. I won't do that introduction because you just did it for me. So next slide. Appreciate you. So I'm just going to briefly go over the demographics, similarly to what we've heard from other communities. Washtenaw County is about, and let me preface, we focus on Black/African American residents, and that we acknowledge that those that were the most oppressed, if you account for their oppression, then you end up hitting everyone else. So a lot of this data is in through that lens. So Black folks make up about 12% of the general population, though they're about 61% of the people that we serve in the homelessness system. Interestingly enough, the majority of our families that we serve in the homelessness system are female head of households, and it's about 73% of those of the families are Black female head of household. As well as another really interesting tidbit is that while Black folks disproportionately are receiving services in the homelessness system in Washtenaw County, they are also proportionately receiving permanent supportive housing resources. We don't know what that means, and that's a lot of what this ongoing work will be about, is to figure out if we are proportionally serving Black folks in comparison to white folks, is there really an equity issue? I would argue yes, but this is what the data shows us so far. Next, Mercedes. So we've done a lot of racial equity work in Washtenaw County. It is one of my passions. It's also one of my side hustles. So there's been a lot of focus on that. Starting September 18, or sorry, not September, I'm sorry. Step 1 of what we've done in 2018, 2019 was we did participate in the racial disparity assessment for the HUD COC funding twice, even though it wasn't obligated. We wanted to be able to start tracking some of this data. Very soon there, within 2018, maybe early 2019, I can't remember off the top of my head, but LA released a report on Black homelessness in their COC system. And so that became an opportunity to spark the conversation locally with the COC board and community around, if LA did this report, what could we do locally in Washtenaw County, and what could some of the recommendations they had there, how could they apply to us? From that conversation, it became very apparent that we need to actually figure out what the local experience has been of Black folks who have used the homelessness system. So in partnership with the Ann Arbor Community Foundation, we held focus groups and paid both folks, people of color with lived experience, to facilitate the focus groups on those on Black homelessness in Washtenaw County, as well as we gave a stipend to people that were actually participants in those focus groups. I think I skipped number 2, and I think it's important. I want to mention that while all of this was happening, we also drafted a racial equity statement to present to the board. We did not present to the board until, as you can, this is on this slide, it might not be, but we just recently presented the racial equity statement to the board. It was created in 2018, but we had it in our back pockets, knowing that we wanted to drive the system to that, but we needed to create buy-in, collect data, prove the need, just to be able to pull it out when it was necessary. So I'm going to jump back to step 5. We published the opportunity for racial equity groups as well as the report. And at that point, that was just recently in June, the COC board did adapt the racial equity statement that we drafted back in 2018. And so now we're at step 6, was create a strategy for implementation of racial equity across the system. Can you go to the next slide, Mercedes? And so here we are, 2020, 2021 is the focus on implementing our racial equity strategy. And it's over 3 different areas. It's a systems perspective, it's an organizational perspective, and it's an interpersonal perspective. On the systems level, we are working actually with Mercedes from CSH around reviewing permanent housing policies and procedures, board composition and activation, leadership composition in the community in general, as well as not necessarily with CSH, but in tangent, website information and sharing. So the systems aspect is, how do we involve leaders, recruit leaders of color into our system? How do we activate the board around solving homelessness with racial equity lens in mind, knowing that the majority of the folks using our homelessness system do identify as Black? What can we do in order for that not to be a thing anymore and to solve homelessness? On the organizational level is we are actually buying a Michigan Nonprofit Association racial equity assessments for each of our COC providers, or the main providers, no better way to say that, about 10 providers who provide permanent supportive housing, rapid rehousing, shelter. We are going to buy that assessment on their behalf so that they can take and receive racial equity feedback on how their internal operations, policies, and procedures advance racial equity. So it's an assessment that's taken by staff and board. It's going to create buy-in, but we are very excited to be able to provide it to each of our providers. We're also going to be implementing peer group with that assessment, bringing together different providers and leaders to review together and figure out ways to implement the different policy recommendations or procedure changes. And we're looking into engaging a system-wide consultant for technical assistance as organizations are asked to do that. And then lastly, we are doing interpersonal work in that the white leaders are creating a peer education anti-racist group amongst themselves to be able to review and learn about what it means to be anti-racist, and that any of these systems and organization interventions that we want to put into implement will all be fought with. It'd just be really hard to engage folks around the changes that need to be happening if people don't do that interpersonal work on themselves. Everything will feel like it's an attack if people are not learning and growing. So that's something that the white leaders are taking on among themselves. We are also going to be implementing a peer education anti-racist group for those that are on the ground doing the work directly with clients in order for them to learn and grow and talk about what's happening with them. And then also, it's just the interpersonal work includes ongoing accountability. How do we make sure that we are calling each other out and inappropriately challenging words that we're using, for instance, such as empowering? You can't really empower someone. You can provide opportunities for them to self-empower, but you can't give someone empowerment. So how do we continue to challenge each other as we talk about those that we work with and as we implement these changes? And that's it for me.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Morgan, for your piece. Also nice and timely. You guys are really impressive this afternoon. We are now going to shift to our last community spotlight. Tasha Gray with hand representing Detroit. Tasha, take it away.
Okay, great. Thank you. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. I am excited to be with you all and just share some of the experiences that we're having here in Detroit as it relates to racial equity. You can go to the next slide, Mercedes. One of the things that Mercedes said to kind of start off is that we are all in different phases of this work. And so that is truly the case here in Detroit. I would classify it the work that we're doing here in Detroit is really some of the emphasis phases really early on in the work that we want to do around racial equity. So I'm going to share with you all some of our experiences, and for some of you who have maybe not started this work, hopefully this will encourage you to kind of get started. And so some of this may look a little bit the same as some slides that Mercedes showed earlier. We did not coordinate that, but I just wanted to give you some context about the Detroit Continuum of Care. You'll see at the bottom our annual as well as our point in time count numbers. So that gives you a perspective about how many people we serve either on an annual basis or a given night. So yes, 10,000 people on an annual basis. And you might be thinking to yourself, that's a lot. And we in Detroit think the same thing as well. As we dig a little deeper into our data and we look at things from a population perspective, you'll see that Detroit really is a mirror image, the reverse image of the state. So looking at the population in the state, for example, and right here I did a really simplistic chart just between Black, white, and other, but we do drill down that other in some of our data reports. So you'll see that at the state level, there's about 79% of people, white people in the state of Michigan, compared to Detroit, where it's 79% Blacks. So again, Detroit really is a mirror image of the state of Michigan, almost down to every other category as well. And so when we start to drill down into our homeless system, you'll see, for example, that Blacks represent 88% of those people experiencing homelessness. So compared to the population of Blacks in Detroit, yes, it's a slight overrepresentation, but it's certainly not what we've seen to the likes of maybe Oakland County and even Washtenaw County. But nevertheless, we still felt like it was important for us to kind of engage in this work because the numbers don't always tell everything. Next slide, please. And so informally for us, this work really began in 2018, and it was sparked by, and no pun intended, by two events. The releasing of a report by Spark on anti-racist communities. And then also I was in attendance at a conference that same year where Mark Dones, who at that time was staff at Spark, was really giving a presentation. And out of both of those things, I think one thing that really stood out to me anyways was that he was able to really show us from a data perspective how really to challenge the thought that homelessness was rooted in poverty. And so he showed some data. He compared poverty rates amongst the different populations amongst the whites and Blacks and so on and so forth, and really challenged the notion that it wasn't poverty that really was the root of homelessness, but able to show with data that, you know, race really played a huge factor in it. And so coming off of that conference, I ran home and really started to get into the ear of my staff. And from there, we started to dig into our data a bit, and we're really able to recreate the charts that Mark had showed us and using Detroit's data. And from there, we really could see the differences as well as, you know, we were able to look at the poverty levels and then able to look at that amongst different races and see how it played out in the homeless system. And so I think for us, it was also an eye-opening experience as well, because when you look at the slide before where it was showing 88% of people who are Black are, you know, in the homeless system, for us, it maybe not seem like such a big deal because 79% of Blacks are overall population in Detroit. And so it didn't seem like a big overrepresentation for us. But as we really just started to dig down a little bit into our data and then think about some of the things that Mark had really challenged us to think about, and this report challenged us to think about it, I think we had to look a little bit deeper. So next slide, please. So really from there, again, that was more of some of the informal work. And then we continued again with some of the informal work. But we recognized, like others were saying, I believe it was Jessica, that the work is, we have to really take a multi-pronged approach looking at our work from a local perspective, but then we also recognize that we aren't the experts and that we were going to need to bring in some national experts as well. And so from a local perspective, what we really did is, again, kind of drilling down into that data. And so you'll see in that pink triangle, everything else really surrounds the data. And so we started to take a look at not only who are we serving, but what are their outcomes? So how are people faring outcome-wise by race? We also then, and some of that was PIT data, HMIS data, AHAR data. We even began to look at our LSA data through Stella to get to answer some of those questions. But we also not only want to know about our clients, but we wanted to know about our leadership. What does leadership look like and who's making the decisions? And then from there, also just kind of take a look at the staff as well. Who is serving our clients and our residents, and what do they look like, and how do that compare to the population that we are serving? And so we were able to answer some of those questions, or begin to answer some of those questions from the data that from looking at our data. Next slide, please. And so, again, as I said, we recognize, though, that we aren't experts. And so even though we were drilling down into our data, we also knew that we were going to need some help. And so we were able to get some help from a national perspective. Much of this work has been funded by the McGregor Fund. So we're very grateful for their partnership with the Detroit Continuum of Care. And so we had two really national experts that have been ingrained in the work that we're doing here in Detroit. One is the Collective Impact Forum. And with the Collective Impact Forum, it has really been nice because we've been able to really take a project, say, for example, looking at a project around racial equity, and get one-on-one coaching, as well as we have worked with some of our peers across the country. We've also been provided with tools and resources. And then we also have brought NIS in, which is the National Innovation Services, and is the home of Mark Dones now. And so the work that they have been doing with us it just really began maybe even a month or two ago. And so they've started to do interviews within our community. And so while we've looked at the data, that's the qualitative work, right? Or the quantitative work, right? But we also wanted to take get some of our data or some of our information from a qualitative perspective. And so these interviews really help us to do that. And so they've been interviewing a range of people within the continuum and with other systems as well, everyone from leadership to staff, even down to clients. And so it really is helping us to better understand how people are faring, how people feel about the work that is happening in Detroit. We're also doing what is called a system audit. NIS is looking at our policies and procedures and going to make some recommendations for us. And then just yesterday, I believe it was, or the day before yesterday, we held a discovery workshop, sort of a forum where we were able to gather, it's about 90 of us or so, and really just talk about what's happening in our system around racial equity. Next slide, please. And so lastly, I guess for us, the work that NIS is doing is right now in more of like an information gathering and a discovery phase. From there, what they're going to be doing is making recommendations and creating an implementation plan. And I think that's a big deal for us because it's now more about not just talking about the work and not just trying to gather information, but also the next phase for us then is really like it has here is pushing that play button and being able to implement the recommendations and move the work forward. Also, in the coming months, HAN, which is the COC lead entity in Detroit, we are going to be hiring what is called an engagement coordinator. And just a little bit more about that. This work for us is not just about racial equity. It's about equity across. And so whether that be gender, sexual orientation, people with lived experiences being incorporated in that work. And so we are hiring an engagement coordinator whose sole responsibility is going to be working with people with lived experiences, assessing what their needs are and seeing how do we get them more fully engaged in the decision-making process and really driving the work forward. So we're excited to have, we're going to be excited to have that position come on in the next few months and to be able to really drive that work forward. So that is just a little bit about the work that we're doing here. Again, like I said, it is really in the beginning phases, but we're excited to be moving forward with it. Thank you.
Thank you, Tasha. Thank you to all of the presenters. That brings us to the Q&A, where we're hoping to hear from you folks. I am going to stop sharing my screen because it just says Q&A and get eyes on the chat. So I am prepared, armed with questions to ask our panelists, but I'm very, very curious what's come up for you all and what may have come in through the chat. So check to see how many participants. So we're sitting at around 72. So it might be dangerous to, to unmute. However, if we can swing it, we'll see. Okay, so folks, you just got an opportunity to hear from 4 incredible panelists about their respective experiences across their communities. And to Tasha's point, just to reiterate, they're in varying spots, right? All the way from infancy to full-fledged implementation, right? And we heard about a lot of exciting things coming out of the work of Balance of State and coming out of Washtenaw and Oakland. And so with that, as you all take it all in, hopefully we can start to take a moment and populate the chat box with questions. So the balance of the session is dedicated to Q&A. I think I see one question from Stephanie Oles with MISHDA. So Stephanie's question is, she's inquiring about whether or not leaders at the Michigan Campaign to End Homelessness and leaders of COCs have ever considered to unify and draw a line in the sand when it comes to paying people running government-funded programs should receive a housing living wage. Okay, so related to pay inequity. Every year, the National Low Income Housing Coalition publishes what the wage should be per county across the country. This could be meaningful given inequities are rooted in who are part of the working poor. And unfortunately, many of our entry-level positions in the homeless system are poverty wages. So Stephanie, that is, I won't speak on behalf of the leadership, the full leadership at the Campaign to End Homelessness. But I will say, I mean, you certainly hit the nail on the head and have flagged something that should be up for consideration, right? Should be something that does get discussed. I'm curious about whether or not any of the 4 panelists in the work that you've progressed thus far in your communities have begun to have conversations that even touch on any of what Stephanie flagged in her question. So I'll be fair and open that up to see if folks have thoughts and would like to share. Any of the panelists?
Mercedes, this is Jessica, and I can talk a little bit about with Balance of State. So we're, in addition to working with Spark right now, we're also working with CSH, and we're looking at kind of how our different resources are divided up across those 61 counties and getting their thoughts on that. And one of their kind of early, we're just starting to kind of get the draft recommendations from them. So this is really new information that hasn't really gone out yet, but how people are reimbursed for the work is one of the things that is within those recommendations. And then, so with getting that and recognizing that that is an issue, and it's not really a big surprise, but we do know like that's going to require us to do some grant amendments on renewal projects, and have a lot of conversations with people at various levels of power, and so it's definitely something that we're thinking about, but I would say pretty early on in that stage, and just knowing that for a lot of our providers, knowing that their budgets are pretty shoestring, a lot of times they have to supplement the projects with, general funds and things. And especially in the smaller rural communities, there tends to be a lot less kind of local government or foundation support available. So that is a very difficult thing, but I do think it's quite necessary. We also, because we don't have very high wages, we see a lot of turnover and burnout. So we know that it's an important thing that we need to figure out how to do, but it's kind of, I think we're just on that first step of the journey and trying to figure out how to do it better.
In Washtenaw County, there have been multiple times where providers have gotten together to try to come up with kind of a pay scale for some of the positions. And that has, that it was successful, though, to the point of the writer, the amount of funding or the salaries for these roles still are not necessarily in congruence with how much it costs to live in Washtenaw County. So it's like a ball where that's constantly tried to be chased. We do, with the county structure, make sure that at least people are being paid living wage if you're in a contract with us. Though again, there's loopholes for that. So what's interesting is that there have been multiple equitable processes made and attempts, but if you always allow the loophole to that, it almost is for naught. So we tried and have succeeded in some areas, but failed in others.
Thank you, Morgan. We have a couple questions that came in. We got some good questions coming in. I'd love to get the panelists to respond to more of you to respond to a question regarding the role of affordable housing. So it's a question, what is the role? What role does affordable housing play in racial inequity? And a big question around what's the solution, right? If it does impact. So maybe Tasha or one of the other panelists want to take that one on. I'd be happy to kick it off or add to it too. I just want to give them an opportunity to hear from you folks.
So for us in Detroit, I think one of the things that was a common theme after NIS did some of the interviews with the various partners is that we have been too siloed in the sense that we've just been focusing on homelessness, but we really need to expand our horizon and start working together jointly around affordable housing and homelessness. So definitely would say that there is work to do, especially in the Detroit area as it relates to like affordable housing and homelessness. That's definitely an impact.
Yes, that has also impacted us in Washtenaw County. One of the trainings that we've done when we kicked off our diversion efforts was to actually have a realistic conversation around, so let's say we're diverting people from the system, assuming them to be able to self-resolve because they have family supports or because they have income. But if we don't have affordable housing for them to self-resolve themselves, but for them to self-resolve into, it's all for naught. So I think they're absolutely connected, especially if we maintain this pull yourself up by the bootstraps mentality in our country. How can you do that without affordable housing in a market that is so competitive and kind of built for those that have wealth?
Yeah, this is Leah. I would agree. I mean, that's a huge issue for us here in Oakland County, and we've been, working on and addressing and talking about affordable housing forever, it feels like. So, definitely looking at some of those pieces and, trying all avenues, landlord engagement to, different ways to have affordable housing projects in our community and address, issues that come up around sort of all of those areas. So absolutely.
And the only thing I'll add before we shift is just getting eyes on Kara's question again. One thing I'll just offer on top of what my colleagues have already shared. I want to center it in the fact that it's not just the lack of affordable housing that's contributing to the racial inequity, right? Even if their housing was plentiful, things like present day discrimination and systematic denial of access, right, for folks of color that we know very much plagues populations of color, particularly those identifying as Black or African American, are layered on top or compounded, right, on top of a lack of affordable housing. So I just hope that we are able to center that and understand that that makes that experience, right, that housing insecurity, that much more brutal for folks identifying as Black or African American. So it's not just a lack of stock, right? It's actually where there may be availability of housing, they may have to deal with encounters with of discrimination with a particular landlord, especially on the private market. So those issues are felt to a different degree for folks of color. So yes, I think that's a great question. Tasha, we had a good question come up for you that I'd love to get your response to. So someone inquired, when you looked closer at poverty levels related to homelessness in Detroit, what'd you find?
Yeah, so it was interesting because what again really challenged our preconceived notion around the fact that it's all income related, and that's what is a contributing factor to homelessness. And so what we started to look at is we started to look at poverty levels by race, and then we started to look at homelessness by race. And so what you would expect to see is that if someone is experiencing, or we expected to see extreme levels of poverty and the same proportion of that represented in a homeless system, and it wasn't the case. For example, we were seeing high levels of whites experiencing poverty, but when we looked at the homeless system, they were only in our homeless system, they're 11%. I don't have the number on hand. I wish I did, about what they represented in terms of poverty. But it definitely, you couldn't draw a clear line and say this, if they're experiencing poverty at this rate, you would expect to see them to show up in the homeless system at a similar proportion. And it wasn't happening that way. And the same was kind of true when we looked at Blacks as well. So it was just interesting to see that the poverty levels didn't seem to impact how they then show how people were showing up in the system being homeless.
Thank you, Tasha. We had another question that has come in, and hopefully one of the panelists can respond. From Martel. So folks are armed with a lot of information, right? A lot of information, a lot of substance. And Martel's looking to understand where to start, right? But is it best to start with more data, better ideas, working with politicians, creating a project? Just, maybe from your experience, and maybe Morgan, you can take this one up because you had just sort of shared that lovely timeline of how you move through things in Washtenaw. How did you get it started? Go back from what you already shared on the slide.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I was very blessed and lucky to step into this role with some of this work having already started, at least on the county and on the system level in the county structure, and that a racial equity office was created, and a racial equity ordinance, and a racial equity officer was all in the process, though it was not specific to homelessness. So what I mean is that it created kind of a climate, and everyone knows and speaks to Washtenaw County being the unicorn or so liberal, right? So I would be remiss in not mentioning that. So my start might have been a little bit easier than other places. all that being said, I'm still a young Black woman in leadership wanting to push forth racial equity. So regardless of the carpet that was laid out, it has been a battle. What I decided to do was start with the things that were within my control. So that's why some of it is a little out of order. We created the racial equity statement way before the LA report was announced. I had a plan way before I had anything to kind of build momentum around like that report, because I knew it just would take the moment. When the moment hit, I'd have to capitalize on it. And it just so happened the report was released, and that allowed me to catapult all the other things because it gave a foundation that I wasn't the one presenting and I didn't create, but they did so much back work on it that it was just an easy, let me show you this thing that someone else did a lot of research on and spent a lot of money figuring out. And why don't we then take that up here? So that was my start. And then everything else after that kind of just laid its path from that point. So my suggestion would be to create your plan, have it ready to go, and wait for that moment for you to be able to pounce on and take up. The pandemic is an excellent one. We already know the disparity. We already got the facts. Use this as the moment.
Thank you, Morgan. Anyone else want to chime in? I have a couple questions that I pulled together while you all were talking that I'm happy to throw into the mix until we get some more questions. Thanks, Tiffany. Okay, well, I have a question for you, Morgan. You talked about on the slide where you showed the racial equity work in Washtenaw broken out at the system, organizational, and interpersonal level. You talked about the groups, the sort of more affinity groups that you've been standing up. How you don't hear about that a lot. When you hear about race equity work at the community level, it's almost always in the system and organizational level, right? The training, right? It's the lower hanging fruit that's plucked almost immediately. Folks get race equity 101 and implicit bias training. Then you start to hear these systems audits and these scans subsequently put in place, but you don't hear about the interpersonal sort of avenues being explored, and certainly not to the level that you talked about in Washtenaw. So I'm curious about how you secured buy-in. Talk to us about how that came to be.
That's a really good question. I think the first way we secured buy-in was, while I had the accountability piece as one of the last steps in the interpersonal piece, it was actually really one of the first one, in that there's a lot of people scattered throughout the homelessness system that do understand and value racial equity work and have been doing it in some shape or form in their own organizations. And so having that accountability and being able to say out loud, hey, I know this is the thing that you think. The empowerment piece is actually a really good example. In a lot of our chronic prioritization meetings, people were always mentioning we need to empower these folks to end their homelessness or to seek resources. And so that became as an entryway to talk about what does empowerment mean and who are you to give someone else the ability to change their own circumstances as if it's their fault. And we know it's not their fault. We talk about it's the larger system, the lack of affordable housing, racist practices in housing, all of that. We know this is a thing, yet we still use words like, how do we empower someone else? So I think the first buy-in piece was to call that out. And then people they were agitated and annoyed and frustrated at being called out. And then after that, oftentimes anger, frustration can be the spark to change. And people wanted to understand what was happening. Why am I getting called out this way? Why is my language being contested? And then that brings you to the interpersonal work, and it helps folks to realize that, oh, there might be some gaps I have or some things that I don't understand in the way that I'm thinking, and that might mean I need to do work on myself. And so it became very clear, and the world was its evidence, that you can have policies and procedures put in place, but we as individuals are the ones that uphold them. And that we will always get in our own way if we don't do that education on ourselves. So it's just like a constant conversation that, again, I and people like me have to have all every single day, all the time. It's a constant attack on who I am as a person, as a Black woman, to have this conversation. It's a battle and it's hard, but it works eventually.
Thank you, Morgan. We have a follow-up question that came in, and then I have a question for Jessica. So the follow-up question to you, Morgan, from Denise is, can you speak a bit more about the white leadership group, the anti-racist leadership group? Do they report back to the Continuum on the work that they've been advancing? And sort of what is the working goal of that group, rather than just discussing anti-racism? Or is it that, right? Like, I don't want to diminish. That would be really important to be doing as well.
So I'm going to say this, and I hope it's like received the best way that I can, but it is literally not my job to know what the white people are doing in their leadership group around anti-racist work. It really is their job and their duty to pull themselves together and in order to educate and teach themselves. So no, they don't report out. I don't know exactly what they're doing. I did hand over resources that I knew of and I had around anti-racist work. And I trust that my colleagues are doing their due diligence and are doing their work to move this work on behalf of the system forward. And we'll see what comes of it.
I appreciate a little self-governing. They're doing awesome. Thank you, Morgan. I have a question for Jessica. So Jessica, earlier you shared the balance of states sort of in the next endeavor phase. So perhaps it's a little too new, but feel free to let me know, to share a little bit more about where you were. Y'all are exploring ways to increase hiring of people of color and folks with lived experience across service providers. Can you talk a bit more about what that looks like? Are you being considerate of the varying levels of hiring to sort of, I'm sure you all have in your research come across the nonprofit leadership gap and better understand that people of color are often not occupying those decision-making roles and don't have the autonomy needed to really advance racial equity related work. So I'm kind of curious if you're being considerate of all the levels that you could increase hiring of people of color across your balance of state provider organizations.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think that's a huge consideration, and this is kind of something that is definitely down the road for us. So we haven't gotten very far in terms of discussing this as a COC or creating kind of a roadmap of what it might look like. But yes, absolutely, to your point, like recognizing that it doesn't mean, just hiring folks into those, frontline, as we discussed early, really low paying positions that don't have any real power and make people feel kind of isolated or just kind of tokenized in their roles. So yes, we would definitely want to kind of advance it in a way that impacts leadership. So part of that is even just looking at kind of our COC governance and looking at within that kind of governance and leadership of our own COC, how do we increase the diversity there? But then, how do we help support communities in their hiring practices? So the other part of that is, like I said, that the demographics really look different across the different parts of the state. And so, reaching out to things, to places like tribal leadership to see, to learn from them, like what is the best way to approach this work with you and to engage with your expertise in helping our work. So we still have a long way to go on that.
Oh, that's exciting. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. See if we get eyes on the chat, see if something else has come in. Maybe Leah, before we close it out, I have a question for you to take. So you talked a lot about the work that Oakland is doing, in particular in partnership with C4, and it's exciting to see philanthropy through McGregor really enable that opportunity. As you think about the next leg of your work and what you have coming up next, how might state leadership or the campaign leadership be supportive to Oakland? Just to give folks a feel for what could state level support look like to really help you drive forward that charge.
That's a great question. And you know what? I haven't put a ton of thought into it. I know that in some of the work that, the state is doing on racial equity and kind of, developing the RFP, I have thought more about that and what does that look like to be supportive and not maybe come to the table, but not be the leader at the table. So I guess I'm still kind of thinking about what that could look like, but I really think it's important, to have all levels involved, but I just want to make sure that this work is driven really by, C4, people with lived experience, just the places that it needs to come from, and not from me, not from, other, leaders in the work, that we really step back and kind of look. So I think I need to think more what that, partnership and support could look like.
Yeah, no, I
think there's a place, I think there's a place for it, of course.
You bet. It's funny in your response, you also offered a response, right? Be at the table, but not be driving, right? Be really complimentary and supportive, but let the experts kind of drive what that looks like. Thank you again, Leah, for your lightning round update on the exciting work that Oakland is doing. It's exciting to see all of the ways in which folks across all 4 communities in varying spots, if there was a such thing as the race equity continuum, where you all would fall, and how in line that work is with the statewide commitment to addressing racial equity as we codified in our new 3-year plan. So thank you all so much. Thank you for the questions that have come in. The participant engagement level was great. Just would love to leave you all with this reminder. We are now, I think we're drawing to the end of the actual sessions, and I am charged with reminding you all or sharing with you that there will be a post-event survey that should be coming to your email box probably within a couple days. Do take a minute or so to fill that out, help us get better at these events. I think that this virtual summit has been quite delightful and packed with a lot of good information, but your feedback around how we can improve it will certainly be very, very much appreciated. So do that. And then also keep your eyes out for an email from the official campaign listserv or to the campaign listserv rather, around the recordings from the sessions and the plenaries and the keynotes, as well as the materials, so the PowerPoint. So keep your eyes out for that. If you haven't already, sign out via the chat so that you can be on the list for the CEUs, especially for those folks who signed in. And thank you all so much for your time. It's 3:15 and I am not about keeping you over. Enjoy the rest of your day. And thank you so much for participating in this session on transforming the service delivery system through racial equity. And thanks again to the panelists.